Aires and their surprise upon finding that when they arrived after World War II. And fundamentally, this talk is about what it means to trace the history of a language, of Yiddish, over many decades after the Holocaust, which we so often associate with the assassination or the decline of Yiddish, and even what it means to trace the history of the language through to the years of a different national trauma, that is, to Argentina's so-called dirty war in the early 1980s. So I'll close the talk with some reflections specifically on the relationship between Yiddish and the dirty war. Now, it may be surprising to us today to think of modern Yiddish culture as existing after the Holocaust at all. And in fact, although Eastern European centers of Yiddish like Warsaw and Vilna were destroyed in the war, significant populations of Yiddish speakers lived in global centers like Moscow, Paris, New York, Tel Aviv, and also Buenos Aires. I found this postcard on eBay labeled unsent, labeled Jewish type Jew, unsent postcard 1928. So here he is in Buenos Aires, and you can see some symbols of the city around him. So it was to cities like these that Jews migrated between the 1880s and the 1920s, creating a global network of Yiddish centers that were connected by the travels of Yiddish theater troupes and Yiddish writers, and by philanthropic and family networks, and by modern Yiddish press and literature. And in Argentina in particular, the first Jewish immigrants to arrive came from the Russian Empire in the 1890s as agricultural settlers. By 1945, the population had grown to roughly 300,000 and had relocated to the growing capital city of Buenos Aires. Jewish Argentines identified with and they maintained the Yiddish language, arguably longer relative to counterparts in other national contexts. So Buenos Aires was a major post-war center of Yiddish publishing and knowledge production about the Holocaust. And this is one reason why I think looking at the course of Yiddish in Argentina is crucial for Holocaust studies. And it was a center both in Latin America, regionally, but also globally. But for decades after 1945, historical scholarship on the Holocaust, as we know, was based on German language documents and perpetrator sources, even though Jewish historians did collect and archive Yiddish language sources that illuminated the Jewish experience and life before, during, and after the war. So in this photograph, you can see readers in 1950 going through the Ringelblum archive, a project to document Jewish life inside the Warsaw Ghetto, buried in these big milk canisters you see here and unearthed after the war. Language barriers and biases shaped the way Holocaust history was written from the beginning. And to quote Holocaust historian David Cesarani, the precipitous decline of Yiddish and the contraction of language closed off much of this source material, finally creating the illusion that it had never even existed. But when survivors of the Nazi genocide came to Buenos Aires, the Yiddish language was already there. And here you can see in this wonderful Getty photograph, a street scene in Buenos Aires, as survivors might have seen it in the mid-1950s. And you can see a few Yiddish papers prominently displayed here on the right. Now, as you may be able to imagine, a street scene like this one would have been a kind of wonderful shock to Holocaust survivors arriving in the 1940s or 50s, having seen the destruction in Europe at close hand. And I'm going to introduce you now to one survivor by way of an example to look at his experience of encountering Yiddish in Buenos Aires, whose story I learned through his daughter, Perla Snee, who is a poet and psychoanalyst in Buenos Aires who continues to be deeply committed to Yiddish literature and scholarship on Yiddish culture and history in Argentina now. In 1947, her father, Itzhak Rosenblatt, had just arrived to Buenos Aires, and he quickly got in contact with the Yiddish newspaper, and he got to work writing columns about Jewish life in Buenos Aires. And in one of his first articles, Rosenblatt wrote about the Sholem Aleichem Shul, the Sholem Aleichem School, a Jewish day school, where children were learning to speak Yiddish as a living language, And he saw their big new building. He wrote about this in the article, their desks and their toys, all of this, children in white uniforms speaking in Yiddish, evidence of Argentina's post-prosperity. And he mused in his article that if his friends in London were able to see what he could see, they would find it too incredible to believe. Because after the destruction in Europe, including the loss, the death of most of his family in Warsaw, Rosenblatt described this discovery of Yiddish in Buenos Aires as, quote, a festive resurrection. And here you can see an article from the Argentine Yiddish press some years later, celebrating a new building for the same school, the Sholem Aleichem Shul in Buenos Aires. Rosenblatt himself, Perlesnay's father, was one of about 10,000 survivors who arrived in Argentina between 1946 and 51, possibly more, and who continued to arrive through the 1950s. And I'm using survivor to refer to this group that arrived after 1945, though they were preceded by a larger group of refugees who came between 1933 and 45, of whom there were some 3 times as many. So like Rosenblatt, most among the survivor group came without visas, and most, also like Rosenblatt, were Eastern Europeans who survived the war by fleeing east to the Soviet Union and subsequently making their way through Europe or through Palestine to Argentina. In Buenos Aires, survivors like Rosenblatt encountered a landscape of cultural institutions founded by Yiddish-speaking Jews, mainly between 1905 and 1930. And by 1936, the majority of Jewish immigrants in Argentina lived in the capital city in Buenos Aires. Jews who had come in the 19th century to settle agricultural colonies, attracted by the liberal policies of the state, had mainly relocated to urban areas. And I'm going to show you now a table and with you that demonstrates the diversity of Jews in Buenos Aires in 1936 and the predominance of Yiddish among that group. So here's this table, I'll go through it. By far, as you can see, they came from a variety of places here. So Eastern Europe, Central Europe, as you look down, and the Ottoman Empire. And by far the largest group up here at the top, 82.6, are Eastern European Jews. And since we can infer from statistics like this that don't explicitly talk about language, but do talk about place of origin, since we can infer that Jews from this region spoke Yiddish, not only Yiddish, but they did speak Yiddish, of the predominance of that language as a kind of Jewish lingua franca among immigrants who came to Argentina. So this is why Yiddish-speaking survivors were so astonished. Yiddish speakers had founded in Argentina all the major cultural institutions, and this gave Yiddish more visibility and status in Argentina than other Jewish languages, of which there were a number. These institutions included 2 daily Yiddish newspapers with a combined circulation of at least 25,000 in the mid-1960s, a Yiddish Writers' Society, and other cultural clubs system where Yiddish was taught, and the Kehila, which was a Polish Jewish institution of communal self-government organized by Jewish immigrants in Buenos Aires and other Argentine cities. These Jewish institutions welcomed the survivors and encouraged their cultural integration, working with Yiddish language education, activism, and writing. Like Rosenblatt, who wrote his report on the Sholem Aleichem School, other survivors were encouraged to speak or write about their wartime experiences in Yiddish and to become involved with Yiddish culture locally. This group of Yiddish survivor writers, pictured here, arrived to Buenos Aires in 1952, legally. As I said, most did not arrive that way. They had been granted visas by a special permission of President Juan Perón after Argentine Yiddish writers petitioned him directly to allow their entry into the country. Survivors were often presented publicly to the Jewish community. And here are some typical announcements from the Yiddish press, clippings from an archive in Buenos Aires, welcoming the Vilna ghetto survivor and partisan Shmerka Kaczerginski from a whole range of Yiddish groups, and they're all listed here on this rectangle on the right side of the picture. So you can see that all the associations that greeted Kaczergiński, and there were kahilas and schools and newspapers, appear here. Part of this welcome and integration of the survivors included organizing exhibits and artworks, but also important publishing projects to memorialize the lost world of Jewish life and culture in Europe. And here I'll show you an image of one exhibit organized by the Yiddish Scientific Institute in Argentina to inform Jewish Argentines about the destruction. The caption here underneath the picture reads, "A Winkel von der Ausstellung," corner of the exhibition. In 1947, it's called Destruction, Resistance, and Reconstruction. And its purpose was to inform Jewish Argentines about the destruction in Europe and also to proclaim the continuity of Yiddish culture in Buenos Aires. As you can see at the top here, there's a banner above the exhibit and it reads, "Mir do, we are here." Refugees were prominent in organizing these kinds of exhibits and tributes. Perhaps the most important of these memorial projects, and one that's widely known today, was the Yiddish book series Das Polnische Judentum, or Polish Jewry. This massive project arguably put Holocaust memory on the map, encompassing about 175 volumes in all about Polish Jewry before, during, and after the Holocaust. The entire series was in Yiddish, even when in some cases, the editors had translated works into Yiddish, mainly from Polish. And all were published after 1946, including an early Yiddish language edition of Night by Elie Wiesel, which in translation has become, of course, one of the best known Holocaust memoirs. The original title, or the Yiddish title, I think there's continuing research on whether a Hebrew edition may even have preceded the Yiddish edition. But the original Yiddish title of Wiesel's memoir was not Night, but in Yiddish, "Und die Welt hat geschwiegen," and the world remained silent. And here you can see an original cover illustration of the Yiddish language edition on the right side of this picture. In fact, it was when I learned about the translation of this translation in the Das Polnische Judentum series through an article that Naomi Seidman wrote, a really great article about the translations of Wiesel's memoir, that I first came to realize just how important Argentina was as a Yiddish cultural center and as a center of knowledge production about the Holocaust. As Wiesel's title suggests, the Yiddish version was angrier in tone, and it was also much longer than the French and then the English translation that we have come to know. And on the left in this picture, you see another volume from the same series, the very first volume in the series, Malka Owsiana erzählt, or Malka Owsiana narrates. Malka was a young Polish Jewish woman who was liberated from the Ravensbrück camp and came to Argentina to join her father, who immigrated before the war. This was the first survivor account published in book form in 1946, and it too was shaped by the perspective of the editor, Mark Turkov, who himself was a pre-war refugee and who based the book on his conversations with Malka and then wrote the account directly himself. So the books in Das Polnische Judentum represent an early project, an important project to create a monument not only to the destroyed cultural world of Ashkenazi Jewry, but also to the Yiddish language itself. And that's especially clear in cases where translations were done from Polish to Yiddish for the series. Survivors like Rosenblatt, Perlesnay's father, who came to Argentina after 1945, in other words, found a really robust Yiddish cultural network that they could enter into and become a part of in spite of the destruction of Yiddish culture and Jewish culture in Europe. And this was astonishing, or as Rosenblatt himself said, it felt like a festive resurrection. Yiddish remained widely spoken, not only among survivors, but in this network of institutions. But, and now I'm going to turn to the longer story of Yiddish here beyond the immediate perception of the survivors that the language was robust and vital. But over the course of the next few decades, survivors' initial euphoria over Yiddish in Argentina came under new strains. And we can think of the challenges to Yiddish in terms of three main developments. One was the growing anti-communism of the Argentine government, associated with anti-Yiddishism because Yiddish and communism were closely tied together, and I'll talk a little about that. The second was the effect of the Argentine diplomatic relations with Israel and the force of Israeli Hebraism or pro-Hebrew policy coming from the state of Israel. And the third was the influence, especially among young people or among the second generation of Jewish Argentines, of new leftist revolutionary movements. So let me say a little bit more about each of those three challenges to Yiddish. First, the growing anti-communism of the Argentine government. When President Perón was elected in 1946, it was with the support of the working classes and many of the unions. And Perón becomes, in terms of national Argentine history, a major inflection point for the course of the country. Even today, the Argentine history is more or less can be talked about in terms of a before Perón and an after Perón. He's an extremely polarizing and monumental figure. And here he is at a rally. By the early 1950s, Perón's government began to actively suppress communists and leftist groups that he perceived as a threat to his position as sole defender of workers' rights. Jewish communists, and by proxy, Yiddish cultural organizations, were among the victims of that repression. And because much Yiddish culture in Argentina was generally coded communist, socialist, or leftist of some variety, whether that meant party membership or not, that reached a broad swath of Yiddish cultural organizational life. So the most public example of anti-communist censorship that affected Yiddish during Perón's presidency and after, under President Frondizi, who succeeded him, was the closing of the Jewish Popular Theater, known by its Yiddish acronym IFT, a Yiddish theater that was visited by immigrants and refugees and survivors alike. From 1952 on, the IFT was a deeply beloved institution among Yiddish speakers in Buenos Aires, and it was repeatedly dogged by Buenos Aires municipal police. And in 1959, its doors were temporarily shackled closed by police. Here you can see some images of the IFT theater in 1951. On the left, as it was at the time, and on the right, the Google Street View from today or recently. This building is still here. It's got a memorial plaque outside. To add insult to injury, the anti-communist repression in the 1950s unfolded at the same time that Argentines were receiving news of anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union. By 1956, the Soviet turn against Yiddish culture was undeniable, and Argentine Jews learned that beloved Yiddish poets had in fact been executed at Stalin's orders several years earlier. In response, the major Jewish communist cultural organization in Buenos Aires, which was known as IKUF, changed their official language from Yiddish to Spanish practically overnight, surprising many. And here you can see a gathering in celebration of this Jewish communist organization in a celebration of the IFT theater, sorry, not of the IKUF, the theater that was closed by police in the 50s. This photograph is from 1962. So what it shows you is the continuing popularity, the continuing social circles and networks among the people that had supported and visited and loved the IFT theater. These losses for Jewish communism in Argentina undermined the security of Yiddish cultural activities, since the language itself was being targeted as part of a local political campaign against an imagined communist threat. A second challenge to Yiddish, and here you can see Golda Meir with Evita Perón, First Lady, in 1951, came from the state of Israel, which declared its independence after the 1948 war. And from its inception, as we know, the Zionist movement had built a national project around return to the land of Israel, and return to the language of the Hebrew Bible. And that linguistic return, however, required that a generation of Zionists, many of whom were native Yiddish speakers, of course, learn to speak a dead language, Hebrew, as a modern vernacular. This generation of Israeli founders who spoke Yiddish but chose Hebrew included diplomats and politicians like first Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion and Labor Minister, and also later Prime Minister Golda Meir, pictured here. With the proclamation of Israel, Hebrew gained a sovereign state. Of course, Yiddish didn't have one. At the same time, Holocaust survivors were ridiculed for speaking in Yiddish in Tel Aviv, and state policies limited Yiddish language publishing and performance. There's a great new book that's just come out on this, if you're interested, by Rachel Rojansky on the history of Yiddish in the state of Israel. So shortly after 1948, President Perón swiftly recognized Israeli sovereignty. He exchanged diplomats, and he was motivated both by a desire to curry favor with the United States, which he imagined was controlled by Jewish power, and to find a new market for Israeli products like beef and grain. The presence of an Israeli embassy was exciting to Jewish Argentines. There was widespread enthusiasm in Argentina and in the Yiddish press for Israel, for Zionism, and the growth of Zionist youth organizations we see reported on in the Yiddish press and in raffles organized by survivors associations for trips to visit the new state. During the early 1950s, the number of Israeli cultural ambassadors and visiting writers and teachers gradually increased. In other words, there was increasing influence of Israeli cultural diplomats to Argentina. And it's worth noting that these Israeli visitors also found the Yiddish cultural landscape in Buenos Aires rather remarkable and surprising, even if they presumed that at some future moment it would give way to Hebrew. In 1955, the Israeli ambassador to Argentina, Aria Kubovi, expressed just that expectation when he attended an anniversary in celebration of the Yiddish daily newspaper Die Presse in Buenos Aires. And he gave his speech actually not in Hebrew, surprisingly, and not in Spanish, but in Yiddish, because Kubovi was also a Yiddish speaker. And he told his audience, I've never really understood what this feud is all about between Yiddish and Hebrew. And he said that he felt there was nothing at all paradoxical about an Israeli ambassador attending a community event in favor, in honor of Yiddish. But Kubovi's positive attitude toward Yiddish was not at all shared by the next generation of Israeli ambassadors who lacked his European upbringing and his familiarity with the Yiddish language and culture. So by 1969, the Argentine Yiddish Writers Association noted in the press that their correspondence to the embassy, to the Israeli embassy, was being completely ignored. And we also see the influence of the Israeli connection in the schools where Hebrew teachers are sent over and over the years, over the 50s and 60s, and schools has shrunk down to nearly nothing, and it's been replaced by increasing numbers of hours of instruction in Hebrew. Of course, Hebrew never became the kind of widely spoken language in Argentina that Yiddish had been, but the Zionist expectation that Hebrew would supplant Yiddish symbolically did have concrete effects in Argentina, most immediately in those changes to curricula in the schools. And we can see how committed and invested some remained in Yiddish education in spite of these kinds of changes by the late date, for example, of this Yiddish language textbook, which was published in Argentina in 1958, likely as a kind of form of resistance to the increasing influence of Hebrew and Hebrew education coming from Israeli teachers in Jewish schools in Buenos Aires. A third challenge to Yiddish, noted by survivors, was the interest among young Jewish Argentines in revolutionary politics and culture. In the 1960s, as an anonymous author wrote, it had become possible to, quote, be an enemy of Yiddish. And this possibility related to Argentine anti-communism and to the rising prestige of the Hebrew language, but it was made even more intense by a coup in 1966 that brought Juan Carlos Onganía into power, initiating a series of military juntas that would last until 1973, and really initiating a kind of political instability that would last through the years of the dictatorship until the return of democracy in the early 1980s, or after 1983. Here is Juan Carlos Onganía at the moment of the coup in 1966. Onganía promised to fight, quote, ideological subversion, infiltration, and chaos. He banned political parties and political activity of any kind, and he repressed the labor movement. In response, workers and students responded with protest and radicalization, and armed guerrilla groups began to form in opposition. And in this context, Jewish Argentine youth became involved in leftist political networks opposed to the dictatorship. A small number, inspired by Israeli military might, left Argentina for Israel after the 1967 war, but they were in the minority. Far more common among Jewish youth was a new interest starting in the 1950s and inspired by the Cuban Revolution, which was very exciting and had made great waves throughout the region, in leftist heroes like Che Guevara. And we can see in the archives of some Jewish leftists their trajectory from Yiddish cultural associations in the late 1940s to a new sympathy with revolutionary movements and leaders of the radical left in the 1950s and 60s. So Jaime Shalubsky, for example, whose records I saw in Argentina, was involved in the creation of a Jewish cultural club in 1947, the Hogar Cultural Mendele in San Martin, which was a Yiddishist club. But by 1955, his priorities had shifted to communism and socialist revolutionary politics. And so among his papers, we find a booklet like this one, full of pictures and clippings and adoration of Che, with a cover that he's decorated himself. In this climate of political repression and rebellion, most young Jewish Argentines rejected Yiddish, turned away from Yiddish as a marker of weakness and victimhood. They wanted instead strong military models, heroes, revolutionary leaders. The Yiddish press reflected not only the estrangement of Jewish Argentine youth from Yiddish, but there were also instances where they shouted down Yiddish speakers publicly. So in 1969, one read that Mark Turkow, who had edited the book series, Polish Jewry, was interrupted at a public group by shouters and scandalmongers. Or in 1971, during a commemoration event of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, a similar thing happened. And as reported in the Spanish language Jewish journal, which had incidentally been founded by a Holocaust survivor, quote, a group of angry young people yelling tried to prevent Catriel Katz, who was a representative from Yad Vashem, from speaking in Yiddish. It was impossible to comprehend, the author of the article said, just what these young people meant by it. But what they meant by it was they rejected what they understood Yiddish to stand for at the time, which was weakness, the immigrant background, and the world of their parents. By the late 1960s, in the context of leftist revolutionary politics, young Jewish Argentines had come to resent the language of their parents and grandparents. To them, they saw the language not as anything with a future, but as a shameful marker of an immigrant past. And all these processes, to some extent, overlapped. If we consider them from the point of view of the survivors, for whom the discovery of that extensive Yiddish cultural network in Argentina had been initially a real revelation or a wonderful shock, we can say that over the course of about 2 painful decades, maybe more, survivors lost a second time over the language that had seemed so alive to them when they first came to Argentina. And now I'm coming to my conclusion, and I'll get to some reflections specifically on tying in this long history of Yiddish from the Holocaust to the national trauma of the Dirty War. So of course, the story of Yiddish in Argentina is a story not only of Holocaust survival or cultural survival in a linguistic form beyond the Holocaust, but more broadly of 1 or 2 or 3 generations of Jewish immigrants for whom the language was a fundamental cultural marker of Jewishness. By the 1970s in Argentina, the cultural survival of Yiddish had become a liability in multiple ways. Yiddish enjoyed no state support. New far-right nationalism in Argentina embraced belief in a Jewish world conspiracy as part of a broader ideological campaign against anti-Argentine subversion. In other words, the worldview of the military and of the general's regime that set out to defend Argentine national sovereignty against this sort of paranoid fantasy of an internal communist enemy was also wrapped up with a certain brand of anti-Semitism that imagined a Jewish world conspiracy. And so this brings us to the Dirty War, which refers to the years from 1976 to 83, when an estimated 30,000 people were killed or disappeared by state military forces. And so I want to close by offering a few reflections on the entanglement of Holocaust memory, the history of the Yiddish language, and the national trauma of the Dirty War. And this is really the piece of the project, the piece of the book project that I'm working on most recently and continuing to develop. So a few reflections here. First, scholars have noted that the striking fact that Holocaust discourse, or talk about the Holocaust, emerged relatively late, in quotes, in Argentina. And it emerged as a product of a comparison with the Dirty War. In other words, Argentina compared the general's regime, or Videla, compared with Hitler and the Nazis, and the crimes of the dictatorship and disappearances compared to the murders of the Jews. And this is in part, large part, because Jewish Argentines represented a significant fraction of victims of the dictatorship, some 10%, relative to their presence of roughly 1% in the general population. And Jews were also prominent among human rights groups and parents of the disappeared, including the organized mothers, or Madres de la Plaza de Mayo, who gained global fame for their courageous demands that the government reveal the fates of their missing children. And we were speaking about this a little bit earlier before the talk. Here is a photograph of Sara Rus with her kerchief, one of the madres holding a photograph of her son, Daniel Rus. So what looking at the long history of Yiddish in Argentina from the early 20th century through the Holocaust and after suggests, I think, is that we need to think about Holocaust discourse in a much longer time frame in Argentina, and as having happened in Yiddish immediately and continuously from World War II on. So that the comparison 1980s and 90s to the Holocaust and talk and discourse about the Holocaust don't really happen for the first time in connection with the dictatorship, but they do cross over into Spanish and enter the Spanish language sphere in public consciousness at that point, crossing over from Yiddish into Spanish. That's one reflection. A second would be to point out, I think, the overlooked fact that Yiddish continues to have a presence during the years of the dictatorship itself. Jewish Argentines used the language to speak privately about the disappearances, to correspond despite state censorship, and to report internationally on the political climate and human rights abuses in Argentina. So for example, I've been listening to oral histories of the children of immigrants and heard examples where somebody will recount having, so in answer to the question, what did you know about the disappearances happening at the time? Well, I didn't know much. In our family, we were typical, people didn't talk about it. It was dangerous to talk about, but my parents, like Jewish parents, they would speak in Yiddish, they would speak secretly, privately, and there's a strong association between the secrecy and the privacy of talking about dangerous subjects and the presence of Yiddish privately in Jewish Argentine homes. The Jewish Daily Forward in New York published a long-running series of letters from Argentina that detailed in Yiddish the nature of the violence as it was escalating from the 70s into the 80s against civilians. And then there's an interesting example of a Jewish Argentine immigrant born in Bessarabia named Hector Katowski, who wrote a letter in Yiddish about the disappearance of his son and sent it to a North American journalist in hopes that it would help bring attention to human rights abuses in Argentina. And in this letter, Katowski explicitly says, I'm writing this letter in Yiddish because it's gonna have more luck getting past the censors this way. At the same time, the anti-Semitism of the military regime meant that Yiddish was even in state-run detention and torture centers. So the 1984 CONADEP report, here and evocatively titled Nunca Más, Never Again, a report from the National Commission about the disappearance of persons. The CONADEP report that publicly revealed the crimes of the military junta against civilians includes instances of police demanding that Jewish prisoners translate Yiddish, even prisoners who were born and raised in Argentina, totally monolingual in Spanish. If they were Jewish, there was a kind of vague association with Yiddish that continued to circulate. So this was the case of Miriam Lewin de Garfa, in whose testimony she says, quote, I replied when they demanded that I translate something that I did not know Yiddish, that I only knew a few words. They nevertheless made me listen to a cassette that they had obtained by tapping telephones. My captors were most interested in finding out what the conversation was about. So they wiretapped a phone conversation in Yiddish, and they demanded that this woman translate the Yiddish, and she said, I couldn't, I only know a few words. So Yiddish was subject to new, but also deeply rooted and continuing stigmas during the years of the dictatorship. And it was associated among Jewish Argentines with danger and secrecy. And lastly, a third reflection here, we might think about the reemergence of interest in Yiddish in post-dictatorship Argentina and today, as it appears thematized in novels or in poetry in Argentina, in terms of a kind of generational reckoning. So as I've said, children of Jewish immigrants in Argentina in the 60s and 70s, they were turning away from and rejecting Yiddish, owing to a range of factors from Israeli Zionism to Third World revolutionary movements and to anti-Semitism. And thus, in contrast, I think, to a certain mainstreaming of Yiddish that happens in US popular culture in the post-World War II period, I think we have to think about Yiddish in Argentina today as symbolic of generational ruptures and national trauma and political rifts between parents and children, made more intense by the national experience of the general's regime. So on that note, I'll stop, and I'm glad to take any questions that you might have. Let me see if I can figure out how to end my screen share here too. Okay, thank you very much. I'm happy to take any questions.
First of all, using our electronic pause to clap if you've seen that. So, but we can also use the real one. Thank you so much. All right, we have a little bit of time for some questions. Yes, David Katz.
Yeah, I have a question. I mean, you mentioned these forces that were working against Yiddish culture in Argentina. Did you find any effort in Argentina to develop schools to train maybe more teachers, or any institutions to grow after World War II to promote Yiddish culture? Like a teacher training academy or something like that to kind of let Yiddish grow.
It's a good question. Absolutely. There were a number of institutions, clubs, all of these institutions really saw it as their mission and their work to extend and in some sense replace or make up for the loss of Yiddish cultural centers in Europe. And so some of the key pillars here would have been the IKUF, the communist aligned cultural organization. There were IKUF branches in other countries as well. This was an organization that was founded in Paris in line with the idea of a popular front. And so there was an Argentine branch of that. There was an Argentine branch of the Yiddish Scientific Institute known in Poland, where it began in the interwar years as the YIVO, and in Argentina as the IVO, due to a slightly different way of pronouncing some of the Yiddish in Argentina, not as Yiddish, but as Yiddish, which is very Spanishized. And of course, the of Yiddish school was transferred very much in the interwar period from Poland to Argentina by teachers and actors. There was also a very important teacher training program in Argentina, which deserves some credit for the fact that many of the most well-known Yiddish linguists and teachers today, many of them came from Buenos Aires, were trained there, and have subsequently made their way to New York or to Tel Aviv or to Paris. And so, yes, much of that transfer happened in the interwar years. And then what we find is after World War II, kind of long denouement or struggle to figure out how could the generation of founders transfer this to their children's generation. And it's at that point that the story kind of becomes one of tension and struggle and finding ways to maintain and to disseminate and to interest the younger generation, which ultimately was an uphill battle. Thank you.
What is going?
Whoever comes next.
So I was going to ask what the situation is with Yiddish in New York. For a while, there was an NPR show, I think it was the Yiddish Radio Project. There was also a production of Fiddler on the Roof in Yiddish. And I just wonder that perhaps the conservative communities there might be trying to resurrect or keep Yiddish going.
Can you say what you mean by conservative? Are you talking
the
about
Hasidic communities that basically are fairly insular as opposed to the more reformed integrated communities?
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think in the case of New York, and I attended Yiddish language training courses myself in New York at the YIVO, which is one of the great centers for training Yiddishists today. I think there's at least two things going on. There's the existence of a Yiddish-speaking Orthodox community in Brooklyn, where Yiddish is quite robust. And by some counts, the number, I've seen some counts that the number of Yiddish speakers in the United States is increasing rather than decreasing right now. And so, you could say, owing to the Orthodox community, Yiddish is in a way doing just fine. And then you have of revival initiatives to translate things into Yiddish, to celebrate and appreciate and revive. And I think much of that is not coming from Orthodox circles, but is coming rather from an interest in reviving and maintaining secular Yiddish culture, and is coming from also from the grandchildren, from an interest in family history. And there is maybe, if we compare the United States or New York and Argentina or Buenos Aires, more resources, more marketing money available for that, more happening than in Buenos Aires. But there's also a stronger history in post-World War II United States. And here I'm not a specialist, but in terms of a comparison, more mainstreaming of Yiddish in popular culture in the United States than in Buenos Aires, where I think owing to political instability, political violence, and the coups and regime change that happened, and then the dictatorship, much less entrance of Yiddish or Jewish speech styles or just general popular knowledge of Jewish culture and Yiddish into Spanish happening in Argentina versus in the United States. So yeah, well, it will be interesting to see where that goes, and how long that kind of revival in New York lasts, or how much for how long that continues.
Has the state of Israel reduced its pressure on Yiddish?
Did you say, has Israel reduced its pressure on Yiddish?
Yes.
Well, yes, and I think that's because there's not much need for Israeli pressure on Yiddish. In other words, and I look forward to reading Rachel Rojansky's book, because I think that kind of goes to the critical chapter in the history of Yiddish in Israel. But early on, there was some period of time, not even after 1948 really, but in the 20s to 30s, where there was some sense that Yiddish was something of a threat in Palestine. And that was because so many new immigrants spoke Yiddish, and it was so audible and visible in Palestine. That was really quickly defeated. And then I think the repression, such as it was in Palestine and then in Israel, in a way, it only needed to be short-lived, so that over time, I think that dropped away as a real interest or preoccupation of the state, because it just was no longer necessary. Once there was kind of a consolidated Hebrew culture, it dropped away. In Argentina, this was a little bit later. It was belated relative to what was going on in Israel, just because of the timing of diplomacy and the timing of generational change and language loss in Argentina. Oh, I saw a hand.
You have a hand and 2 questions in the chat function. So all
Okay.
lights are on right now, but I think Rosie goes first.
Okay.
Thank you. Did you follow if there was any significant number of people from Argentina under the dictatorship that migrated to Mexico City?
Thank you. Under the dictatorship that migrated to Mexico City, I am aware of at least one Argentine poet, though her name is going to escape me right now, who did go to Mexico City, and more broadly, not specifically Jewish, there was an important emigre community of Argentine intellectuals to Mexico City. So that's not something I have researched specifically, though it would be interesting to look further into. And I'm sure it was the case. Yes.
2 questions from the chat function. One from Amel. What is the status of Yiddish in contemporary Argentina?
Well, I would say generally the status of Yiddish in contemporary Argentina relates to the restoration of democracy and a reopening of interest in multiculturalism, although with the caveat that when we speak about multiculturalism in any context, but in Argentina, there is a lot of interesting writing now about race and nationalism in Argentina. And so that has to be taken with quite a grain of salt. But in terms of the entry of Yiddish or Jewishness into popular culture, it has a wider presence now probably than ever before. The revival of interest in Yiddish doesn't compare at all in scale to what we see in New York with the translation of Fiddler on the Roof, but there are still institutions like the IFT Theater that exist that will put on Jewish plays. So there's sort of a minor current of revival.
Very good. And then we have another one from Ella. Why were people so afraid of communism in Argentina?
Well, the fear of communism in the Argentine context, and that's a great question because it's important in the region, in Latin America, goes back as any discussion of the Cold War does, really to much earlier in the 20th century. And so after 1917, Argentina was a major destination for immigrants. Italian, Spanish immigration was very important in Argentina, and then Jewish in the 1920s, many Jews coming from Poland, many who were very excited by the revolution and very caught up in revolutionary politics. So all of this kind of folds in with an elite versus popular, governing nationalists versus the rabble, a fear of urban disorder and chaos, a lot of kind of well-known modern concerns in cities in the 1920s, and Buenos Aires had this too. So there are roots there. And then, of course, later after the Cuban Revolution, we see across Latin America, many governments fearful that there will be a leftist insurgency, that guerrilla groups and student movements and basically all kinds of movements looking for an opening up, greater amount of democracy, that they will somehow overturn the state. And this becomes a paranoid context and justification for state-led wars against civilians. And so this is what happens in Guatemala to some extent, also in Argentina, in Operation Condor throughout the Southern Cone. And this is fueled, of course, by the leadership of the United States in its anti-communist agenda. So that relates to both to Argentine history of immigration and also to the Cold War context in the region and in our hemisphere over here.
Very good. Then I think we have another comment and a question there. Many from Angela, many Argentinians, goes back to an earlier question, indeed migrated to Mexico and Spain. So this kind of internal migration. Could you talk about the melting pot situation in Argentina?
The melting pot, yes. And can I ask, can I ask the questioner if there's something in particular there you'd like me to get to, or are you looking for a kind of general definition of how that works in the Argentine context?
Yeah, this is Angel Fisher. I am from Argentina, and thank you very much. An excellent presentation.
Thank you.
I lived in Argentina till 1968, 69. Okay, and I just you mentioned that at the very end, the idea that societies tend to have basically one language idea. It's happening in the US, it happened in Israel, that they wanted Hebrew instead of English and Yiddish. So that's, if you have read about what happened with any language, it was not only Yiddish, but also English and other Italian, other languages that were widely spoken in Argentina, and society was not in favor of that.
Mm-hmm.
So not
Yes,
much
well,
of a melting pot. Is that
Right.
the idea?
Right, and there has been an argument advanced that that it was with the election of President Perón that Argentina experienced its first moment of openness to multiculturalism, and that was because Perón, as a champion of the working classes, was also in a way more open to a broader definition of who could be considered an Argentine. But that view of him has also come under quite a bit of fire in reviewing the history of whiteness in Argentina, which really Perón did not at all challenge, although he made certain shallow promises to indigenous Argentines, or in Peronist propaganda, the colors of people's skins who were included in the visual iconography or visual propaganda of Peronism was in some ways more diverse linguistically, which is what we're talking about. I have heard Argentines say that they consider it an extremely monolingual place in society, and of course that to that we have to add that the Italian language and the Galician Spanish and all of the immigrant languages did have an enormous influence on Argentine Spanish, and much of the beauty of Argentine Spanish and of as Porteño or Buenos Aires Spanish comes from the melody of the Italian language, which carried over from the immigrant waves into Spanish.
All right, there's another question in the chat. I think indirectly we had already almost walked by it, the Shalom Aleichem Shul. What has happened to it today? You mentioned that there's a plaque outside, which kind of suggests, that it's more a place where the past is referenced rather than still alive. Is that correct?
The IFT Theater is still around, and the Shalom Aleichem Shul is also still around. The Shalom Aleichem School is a Jewish school. It does no longer teaches Yiddish, but it is still functioning in Buenos Aires now, yes.
Let me maybe ask, just while everyone is taking a moment, just ask also one other question. Yeah, I really appreciated the extent to which you walked us through this kind of immediate aftermath, the vibrancy of Yiddish culture, and then the various challenges, chronicling rather the decline of Yiddish over the decades to come. But my question is, would it not be right to say that whether it was, the publications on Yiddish culture before the Holocaust and during the Holocaust never had as intended reader only people in Buenos Aires, but always the books published in Yiddish were anchored in, so to speak, in the Yiddish-speaking world in Buenos Aires, but always intended actually to disseminate far more widely, and that in many ways, if we really wanted to gauge the significance of that short but really intense moment, we would have to not just look at Buenos Aires, but virtually everywhere else. Because it's probably fair to say that most of the books that were published there ended up not in Buenos Aires, but today, if we were to look them up, we would find many of them in New York, we would find some in Amsterdam and London, Paris, and God knows where, right?
Yes, that's true. Those books ended up, I think they were shipped to more than 30 countries around the world. They are now well known source for Holocaust history by scholars who are consulting the Yiddish language sources. They all owe a debt of gratitude to Samuel Różański, who was involved in also the Musterwerk series that put together exemplary works of Yiddish literature. And in fact, that presents something of a challenge in studying the immediate local context of Yiddish Buenos Aires, because then one finds that many of the imprints that are coming out of Argentina are not in a way immediately reflective of what was happening in Argentina. So it creates a kind of odd disconnect in the archive between this global library that really was about reaching audiences in other places. And then there are the rare examples of, say, a Yiddish novel that is about a murder mystery, Palermo in Buenos Aires, which has not reached much of an audience. It didn't have a global audience at the time, and people were not necessarily interested in a murder mystery written in Yiddish taking place in Buenos Aires. They wanted to know about the history of Jewish life in Europe, and that's what a lot of this material was about.
Thank you. I think we take a few more questions. Rosie is waving across the screen there. Yes. You have to unmute yourself, Rosie.
Thank you. I must go, but I want to thank you very much for this wonderful event. We look forward to seeing more from UT Dallas to the Ackerman Center. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for coming.
Bye. Thank you for being with us. Any more questions in the chat function or verbally or otherwise?
Yeah,
Yes.
this is Angel again. If you want to comment about the difference between the Jewish authorities and the Jewish population in Argentina during Perón and the junta situation.
Well, let me focus on the junta, because I think that's the more controversial and therefore somewhat more interesting. Perón was not successful in his bid to win the support of the Jewish vote in Argentina. I think broadly speaking, one could generalize about the Perón era by saying Jewish Argentines were skeptical of Perón. He did have some followers, but for the most part, he did not succeed in casting off the general figure of the fascist dictator at the time. But during the general's regime, and this is important, the leaders of the formal Jewish community institutions were not vocal opponents of the dictatorship. They did not generally do what many Jewish Argentine parents and family members of the disappeared wished they would do, which was to speak out and to exercise their influence, their institutional power to get information about the whereabouts of the disappeared. And this became something of a controversy after it became an object of research after the dictatorship. And when Gabriela Lauterstein in particular carried out many oral history, which are available now at the Hebrew University's Oral History Institute, or hopefully will be soon at some point in the pandemic, and found really that there was a lot of discontent, and eventually there was a kind of formal apology issued when the AMIA and some of the other major institutions acknowledged this fact that they had really failed the Jewish Argentine community when it came to using power to do anything about learning more, pressuring for the release of prisoners, et cetera. So that has been a source of some pain and controversy. Yes.
Lord, thank you.
All right, then I think unless there are any more questions, then I think this brings it to an end. Let me again thank you all for being here, and obviously also thank our wonderful speaker, Dr. Kerner, Amy, and welcome again to the Ackerman Center and to Dallas, Amy.
Thank you very much, and let me thank you all also from Dallas and Tulsa to Turkey. Thank you very much for being here this afternoon or tonight or this morning or wherever you are. It was a pleasure to speak with you all, and I hope we'll have another opportunity to do it eventually in person.
Goodbye, everyone.